HFY had never questioned the order of things. As a junior intelligence officer aboard the Kethmoran battlecruiser Dominion's Edge, he understood his place in the galaxy's hierarchy as clearly as he understood the patterns of stellar drift. The Kethmoran hegemony ruled the outer spiral arms with absolute authority, their crystalline warships cutting through space like shards of frozen starlight. Below them, in carefully arranged tiers of subservience, came dozens of client species, each knowing their role, each content with their allocated portion of the cosmic order. The humans were nothing special. That's what every briefing had told him, what every tactical analysis confirmed, what every senior officer believed without question. When the hegemony had first encountered the species called humanity 3 cycles ago, they had been dismissed as another minor spacefaring race technologically adequate, but lacking the crucial elements that separated true galactic powers from mere star wanderers. They possessed no crystalline matrix technology, no quantum fold capabilities, no psionic networks. Their ships were crude metal, constructs that burned chemical fuel and relied on primitive fusion reactors. HFY's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his kind as he reviewed the human files again. The species had been classified as Level 3 autonomous, meaning they were permitted to govern themselves within their small cluster of systems, but were expected to comply with hegemony trade regulations and territorial boundaries. It was a generous arrangement, really. Many species didn't even achieve autonomous status, they were simply absorbed into the hegemony as client worlds. Their populations relocated as needed for optimal resource extraction. The humans had seemed grateful for their classification. Their diplomatic representatives strange, bipedal creatures with soft pink or brown skin and those peculiar optical organs that moved independently in their sockets had signed the concordat of recognition with what appeared to be genuine relief. They established trade routes, submitted their required resource reports, and generally behaved like a species that understood its limitations. HFY found their appearance unsettling in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Unlike the Kethmoran, who had evolved from crystalline coral organisms and possessed bodies that reflected light in complex patterns, humans were entirely organic. They had no natural armor, no particle beam capability, no ability to interface directly with their technology through bioneural links. Instead, they manipulated crude external devices with their flexible appendages, fingers. They called them and processed information through what seemed to be an inefficient central nervous system. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of specialization. In every other species the hegemony had encountered, individuals were born into specific castes with predetermined functions. Warriors were bred for combat, scientists for research, workers for production. But humans seemed to move randomly between roles, changing their function based on training or inclination rather than genetic programming. It was chaotic, inefficient, and somehow wrong. The first sign that something was different about the humans came during a routine patrol along the Kepler transit corridor. HFY had been monitoring communications traffic when he picked up a distress signal from a human merchant vessel called the Jenny's Dream. The ship had apparently suffered a cascade reactor failure while carrying a cargo of medical supplies to one of their colony worlds. Standard protocol for such situations was clear. If the vessel belonged to a hegemony client species, assistance would be rendered according to their classification level. Level 3 autonomous species were entitled to emergency beacon relay and navigation data, but rescue operations were considered their own responsibility. HFY dutifully logged the distress call and prepared to transmit the standard automated response. What happened next violated every assumption he held about space travel protocol. Within 6 standard hours, and impossibly short time frame, 3 human ships had altered course to reach the disabled vessel. Not rescue ships, but whatever had been closest, a cargo hauler called Distant Thunder, a passenger liner named New Horizon, and most remarkably, a small private spacecraft that appeared to be some kind of recreational vehicle. ZEX single quotes as AI watched in fascination as the 3 ships worked together to Evacuate the Jenny's Dream. The cargo hauler jettisoned its entire load of processed metals to make room for refugees. The passenger liner reconfigured its environmental systems to accommodate twice its normal capacity. The little recreational craft, barely large enough to hold 6 individuals, somehow managed to rig up an emergency medical bay in what had obviously been designed as a leisure compartment, but the most extraordinary part was yet to come. When it became clear that the Jenny's Dream's reactor was destabilizing beyond any hope of repair, the crew of the Distant Thunder did something that defied all logical analysis. They deliberately positioned their ship between the failing vessel and the other craft, using their cargo hauler's bulk as a radiation shield while the final evacuations took place. The Distant Thunder was vaporized 3 minutes later when the Jenny's Dream's reactor underwent complete cascade failure. 26 humans died instantly, but their sacrifice had saved the remaining 137 refugees. HFY spent days trying to understand the logic behind this behavior. In his own society, such a decision would have required authorization from at least 3 levels of command hierarchy, extensive cost-benefit analysis, and formal risk assessment protocols. The crew of the Distant Thunder had made their choice in a matter of minutes, apparently without consulting any higher authority at all. When he finally submitted his report on the incident, his superior officer, Commander Yithlus, dismissed it with barely a glance. Inefficient resource allocation was her only comment. Their emotional responses override practical considerations. This is why they remain a minor species. But HFY couldn't stop thinking about it. In the following cycles, he began paying closer attention to human activities within the hegemony's sphere of influence. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he understood about civilization and survival. Humans seemed to form emotional attachments, not just to their immediate genetic relatives, but to complete strangers. They risked their lives for individuals they had never met, simply because those individuals belonged to their species. Even more incomprehensibly, they sometimes extended this protective behavior to non-humans. There were documented cases of human cargo pilots altering course to assist stranded Veltar mining operations. Despite the fact that the Veltar had no formal alliance with humanity and offered nothing in return except a simple acknowledgement of gratitude, their approach to problem-solving was equally baffling. Where other species relied on established protocols and proven methodologies, humans seemed to improvise solutions on the spot. HFY found reports of human engineers jury-rigging life support systems, using spare parts from entertainment devices. Human doctors performing surgery with tools improvised from kitchen implements. Human pilots landing damaged ships using navigation techniques that by all rights should have been impossible. Perhaps most disturbing was their apparent relationship with risk. Every other species the Kethmoran had encountered followed the sensible principle of calculated caution. If an action had more than a 30% chance of failure, it was generally considered inadvisable. But humans seemed to attempt things with 50, 60, even 70% failure rates, and somehow succeeded anyway through sheer determination and what they called thinking outside the box. The more HFY studied them, the more convinced he became that humanity represented something genuinely unprecedented in galactic civilization. They were adaptable in ways that shouldn't have been possible, cooperative beyond all logical parameters, and stubbornly persistent in the face of overwhelming odds, yet the hegemony continued to classify them as a minor species. In fairness, their military appeared to justify this assessment. Human warships were small, crude affairs that relied on kinetic weapons and chemical explosives rather than sophisticated energy manipulation technologies. Their largest vessels couldn't match even a medium Kethmoran cruiser for raw firepower, and they had never demonstrated any of the advanced capabilities that marked true galactic powers. This changed during what became known as the Proxima Incident. The trouble began when a hegemony science expedition detected unusual energy readings from the Proxima Centauri system, which fell within the humans' territorial sphere. Standard procedure required that human authorities be notified of any hegemony scientific activities within their space, But the expedition leader, Subcommander Veltheron, decided that such formalities were unnecessary for what was classified as a minor observation. Mission: the science vessel. Seeking Truth entered the Proxima system without authorization and began conducting detailed scans of the third planet, which appeared to have undergone some kind of massive terraforming project. What they found there was extraordinary evidence of large-scale atmospheric modification, continent-sized engineering projects, and what appeared to be experimental gravity manipulation technology far in advance of anything in the human technological profile. Commander Veltheron realized immediately that this discovery could change every. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came 6 hours after Captain Chun's final transmission, when the Seeking Truth detected an impossible number of hyperspace signatures converging on the Proxima system. Zexai was on duty in the intelligence center of the Dominion's edge when the data started flowing in. His bioluminescent patches flickered in confusion as he processed the readings. According to the sensors, over 200 human vessels were approaching Proxima from every direction: civilian cargo haulers, passenger transports, mining ships, even what appeared to be privately owned recreational craft. "This must be sensor malfunction," Commander Yithlas declared when Zexai presented the readings. "Humans don't have 200 warships in their entire fleet." But they weren't warships. That was what made the situation so incomprehensible. Sub-Commander Veltheron, still aboard the damaged Seeking Truth, requested immediate evacuation as the human vessels began arriving. His distress calls painted a picture that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The approaching ships weren't following any recognizable tactical formation. They weren't broadcasting standard military identification codes. Many of them weren't even military vessels at all. Instead, they were converging on his position like a swarm of angry insects, each ship apparently operating under independent command but somehow coordinated toward a single purpose. Veltheron reported that his communications officers were receiving hundreds of individual transmissions, not from a unified command structure but from individual ship captains, cargo pilots, even civilian passengers. The content of these messages was unprecedented in Zexai's experience. They weren't formal military communications or diplomatic protest. They were personal. Individual humans speaking directly to the crew of the Seeking Truth, expressing their anger at Captain Chun's death and their intention to make the Kethmoran pay for it. "My name is Marcus Rodriguez, captain of the cargo hauler Iron Will," one transmission began. "Sarah Chun was my daughter's godmother. You killed her. Now you answer to me." Another came from someone who identified herself as Dr. Elena Vasquez. Aboard the passenger liner New Dawn, "Captain Ching saved my research station during the Vega crisis. I owe her my life. Now I'm here to collect yours." Hundreds of similar messages flooded the Kethmoran ship's communication systems. Each one was personal, emotional, and utterly without military protocol. But taken together, they created a picture that sent ice through Zexai's crystalline nervous system. Humanity was responding to the death of a single individual, not as a government or military organization, but as a unified organism. Every human who had heard Chain's final message had apparently dropped whatever they were doing and come to Proxima seeking revenge. Commander Yithlas ordered the Dominion's Edge to alter course for the Proxima system. "We need to extract our science team before these primitives do something they'll regret," she announced. But Zexai noticed the uncertainty in her bioluminescent patterns. The sheer number of human vessels was beyond anything in their threat assessments. What happened next shattered every assumption. The Kethmoran held about human military capabilities. The first ship to engage the Seeking Truth was the cargo hauler Iron Will, captained by the man who claimed Sarah Chun had been his daughter's godmother. The vessel was completely unarmed by military standards. It carried only the minimal defensive systems required for merchant shipping. By all logical calculations, it should have been destroyed by the science ship's particle beam weapons before it could close to effective range. Instead, Captain Rodriguez had done something that no Kethmoran engineer would have considered possible. He had modified his cargo bay to carry a massive kinetic impactor, essentially a guided asteroid powered by his ship's main engines. When the Seeking Truth opened fire, Rodriguez jettisoned his ship's entire superstructure, using the bulk of his vessel as a shield while the improvised weapon streaked toward its target. The impact cracked the science ship's hull in 7 places and completely destroyed its primary weapons array. Veltheron's ship was crippled, but more importantly, it had been crippled by a freighter captain using jury-rigged weapons that shouldn't have existed. Before the Seeking Truth could recover, 12 more human vessels engaged simultaneously. Each had been modified in ways that defied conventional weapons technology. The passenger liner New Dawn had somehow converted its atmospheric processors into kinetic accelerators, launching streams of metallic debris at significant fractions of light speed. A small research vessel called Curiosity had rigged its lab equipment to generate focused electromagnetic pulses that disrupted Kethmoran shield harmonics in ways that should have been impossible without detailed knowledge of crystalline matrix technology. But perhaps most terrifying was what the humans called their swarm tactics. Instead of engaging individually, the human ships coordinated their attacks through what appeared to be purely improvised communication. Ship captains shared targeting data through open channels, adjusted their attacks based on real-time damage assessment, and modified their tactics moment by moment based on observed results. Zexhai watched in growing horror as the humans demonstrated capabilities that his species' military doctrine insisted were impossible. They were learning and adapting in real time, turning civilian equipment into weapon systems and coordinating complex multi-ship attacks without any apparent central command structure. The Seeking Truth lasted 18 minutes against the human swarm before Veltheron transmitted his surrender. But the humans weren't interested in surrender. Sarah Chun didn't get a chance to surrender, came the response from Captain Rodriguez. Neither do you. The Kethmoran science vessel was reduced to scrap metal and expanding plasma. Zexhai later learned that the humans had deliberately avoided targeting the ship's escape pods, but only after they had confirmed that every member of the Seeking Truth's crew was dead. Commander Yithlas arrived in the Proxima system 3 hours later with a full battle group: the cruiser Dominion's Edge, 2 escort destroyers, and a heavy assault platform carrying a full regiment of Kethmoran Marines. It should have been more than sufficient to scatter the human mob and restore order to the system. Instead, they found themselves facing something that no Kethmoran tactical manual had prepared them for. The human ships hadn't dispersed after destroying the Seeking Truth. They had formed a defensive perimeter around Proxima 3 and were actively coordinating their positions through what appeared to be a completely improvised command structure. Cargo captains were issuing tactical orders to passenger liners. Research vessel crews were sharing sensor data with mining ship operators. Individual civilians were volunteering for boarding parties and assault teams. More disturbing still, additional human ships were continuing to arrive. The destruction of the Seeking Truth had been broadcast throughout human space, and apparently every ship capable of reaching the Proxima system was converging on the battle zone. They came in waves: merchant fleets from the core worlds, exploration, vessels from the frontier sectors, even ancient colony ships that had been converted to cargo haulers decades ago. Commander Yithlas attempted to establish communication with what she assumed must be the human military command. Instead, she found herself talking to a rotating council of ship captains who seemed to be making decisions by informal consensus. "This is Commander Yithlas of the Kethmoran hegemony," her transmission began. "You have committed an act of war against a legitimate scientific expedition. Withdraw your forces immediately or face the consequences." The response came from a woman who identified herself as Captain Maria Santos of the mining vessel Deep Digger. "This is human space, Kethmoran. You killed one of ours. Now you pay the price. Leave now, or we'll send you home in pieces." Yithlas was astounded by the casual insubordination. Captain Santos was apparently the commander of a civilian mining operation, yet she was speaking to a Kethmoran battle group commander as if she had equivalent authority. More incomprehensibly, the hundreds of other human ship captains seemed to accept her right to do so. "You are significantly outgunned," Ythlas replied, activating her ship's targeting systems. "We are prepared to use force." The human response was unlike anything in Zexhia's experience. Every human ship in the system simultaneously activated what could only be described as suicide protocols. Engines were diverted to maximum output, reactor safeties were disabled, and cargo bays were open to vacuum as their contents were reconfigured into improvised weapons. The humans weren't just prepared to fight against superior odds, they were prepared to die taking as many Kethmoran with them as possible. "You want to see what happens when you threaten humanity?" Captain Santu's voice carried across all communication frequencies. "Come and find out." For the first time in his career, Zexhi watched a Kethmoran commander hesitate in the face of a clearly inferior force. Commander Ythlas stared at her tactical displays, processing the incomprehensible scene before her. The human ships were positioning themselves for ramming attacks, their crews apparently willing to sacrifice themselves for the chance to damage Kethmoran vessels, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what the intelligence scanners were detecting at the edge of the system. More human. The hegemony's response to the Proxima incident was swift and predictable. Within 2 standard cycles, High Command had classified humanity as a Level 2 restricted species, implemented a complete trade embargo, and begun mobilizing the Third Fleet for what they called a corrective military action. Zexhi watched the preparations with growing unease. The Third Fleet represented one of the hegemony's most powerful military formations: 47 capital ships, over 200 escort vessels, and support craft carrying enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems. It was commanded by Admiral Kestharan, a decorated veteran who had successfully suppressed 17 different species. Rebellions during his career, the official justification, was that humanity had demonstrated aggressive, expansionist tendencies and posed a potential threat to regional stability. The real reason, which everyone understood but nobody stated openly, was that the humans had humiliated the hegemony. They had destroyed a Kethmoran science vessel and forced a battle group to retreat. Proving that the galaxy's accepted hierarchy could be challenged, High Command couldn't allow that precedent to stand. The Third Fleet's mission parameters were simple: enter human space, destroy their military capabilities, and occupy their key worlds until a new government could be installed that understood its proper place in the galactic order. Intelligence estimates suggested the operation would take no more than 6 standard cycles to complete. Zexhi was assigned to the fleet as an intelligence analyst, partly because of his expertise in human behavior and partly because his superiors wanted first-hand observation of how the human problem was resolved. He reported aboard the fleet flagship Eternal Dominion, a massive dreadnought that alone carried more firepower than the entire human defense force. As they approached the border of human space, Zexhi reviewed every piece of intelligence data they had collected about humanity's military capabilities. Even accounting for the technological surprises they had demonstrated at Proxima, the analysis seemed straightforward. The humans had perhaps 50 genuine warships scattered across a dozen star systems, with no significant orbital fortifications or deep space defensive networks. The Third Fleet should have swept them aside without difficulty. The first sign that something was wrong came when they crossed into the outer boundary of human territory, a region the humans called the Frontier Zone. According to intelligence reports, this area was lightly populated, consisting mainly of mining colonies and research outposts that would offer token resistance at most. Instead, they encountered the most sophisticated defensive network Zexhi had ever seen. The humans had apparently spent the cycles since Proxima turning every piece of rock larger than an asteroid into a weapons platform. Mining stations had been converted to missile bases. Research outposts had been reconfigured as sensor arrays. Even the automated cargo platforms that served the frontier colonies had been armed with kinetic weapons and crude but effective targeting systems. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that every single installation was manned by volunteers. As the Third Fleet engaged the frontier defenses, Zexhi monitored the human communications traffic. What he heard challenged every assumption he held about rational behavior under combat conditions. The mining stations weren't surrendering when their shields failed. The research outposts weren't evacuating when their weapons were destroyed. Instead, they were fighting to the death, buying time for their families and colleagues to escape deeper into human space, a typical exchange. Recorded from the defense platform at the Kepler 442 system, exemplified the pattern. Kepler Station. This is Admiral Kethleran of the Kethmoran Third Fleet. Your position is hopeless. Surrender immediately and your personnel will be treated according to the standards of civilized warfare. The response came from someone who identified himself as Dr. James Patterson, apparently a xenobiologist who had volunteered to operate the station's weapon systems. Admiral, this is Dr. Patterson. I'm a scientist, not a soldier. But I've got a wife and 2 kids on the colony transport that left here 6 hours ago. You want this station, you'll have to take it from my dead hands. Dr. Patterson held his position for 47 minutes against 3 Kethmoran destroyers, using improvised weapons and tactics he had apparently learned from downloaded military manuals. When his station was finally destroyed, he had inflicted enough damage to force one of the attacking ships to withdraw for repairs. The pattern repeated across the entire frontier zone. Scientists became gunners, miners became strategists, and families became military units. The humans were converting their entire civilian population into combatants, not through conscription or coercion, but through apparently voluntary choice. Admiral Kethleran's initial confidence began to waver as the casualty reports mounted. The Third Fleet was winning, but they were paying for every victory with blood and time. What should have been a rapid advance through lightly defended space had become a grinding campaign against fanatically determined defenders. Then they reached the core systems. As HFY discovered what humanity had been doing during the cycles since first contact with the hegemony, they had been preparing for war, the human defense force that met. The Third Fleet at the Sol system bore no resemblance to the primitive military organization described in hegemony intelligence files. Their ships were larger, faster, and armed with weapons that seemed to violate several fundamental principles of physics. More disturbing still, they fought with a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that suggested years of intensive preparation. Admiral Morrison's flagship, Indomitable, had been joined by sister ships of the same class, the Relentless, the Unstoppable, and the Vindicated. Each was a hybrid technological marvel that somehow integrated the best innovations from every species humanity had encountered. They carried Veltar plasma cannons, Zephyrion quantum shields, Mokari stealth systems, and weapons technologies that HFY didn't recognize at all. The battle for Sol lasted 18 hours and redefined everything HFY understood about space warfare. The humans didn't fight like any species in hegemony experience. They didn't maintain formation, follow established tactics, or prioritize asset preservation. Instead, they seemed to approach combat as a problem-solving exercise, adapting their strategy moment by moment based on observed results. When Kethmoran ships used their superior range advantage to engage from a distance, human vessels would suddenly accelerate to impossible velocities, closing the gap before the crystalline matrix targeting systems could compensate. When the Third Fleet tried to use their numbers to overwhelm individual human ships, the defenders would coordinate attacks that somehow allowed smaller vessels to damage much larger opponents. Most unsettling of all was their apparent disregard for acceptable loss ratios. Human captains routinely sacrificed their ships to create opportunities for their fleetmates, using kamikaze tactics that should have been prevented by basic self-preservation instincts. But they weren't mindless berserkers. Each sacrifice was calculated, timed, and coordinated to achieve maximum strategic impact. HFY watched in horror as the human ship Defiance Revenge deliberately positioned itself in the path of a Kethmoran dreadnought's main particle beam, using its own destruction to mask the approach of 3 smaller vessels that proceeded to cripple their attackers' engine systems. The sacrifice had been planned, coordinated, and executed with precision that suggested extensive rehearsal. But the most terrifying Moment came when Admiral Morrison opened a direct communication channel to the Eternal Dominion. During the height of the battle, Admiral Kestharan, her voice, carried clearly across the chaos of combat. You made a mistake when you decided to threaten our families. You could have left us alone in our little corner of space, and we would have been content to trade with you and learn from you. Instead, you chose to test our resolve. The human admiral's image appeared on the main display, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and scars across her face that spoke of extensive combat experience. Her expression was calm, almost conversational. Despite the fact that her ship was surrounded by enemy vessels, let me show you what humanity is really capable of, she continued. That's when the Indomitable activated what could only be described as a planet-killer weapon. The energy signature was unlike anything in Kethmoran science, but the effect was unmistakable. A focused beam of exotic particles punched through the shields, armor, and superstructure of 3 Kethmoran capital ships simultaneously, reducing each to expanding clouds of plasma in a matter of seconds. But Admiral Morrison wasn't finished. You see, Admiral, we've been studying your technology for cycles now. Every trade mission, every diplomatic exchange, every piece of hegemony equipment we could get our hands on, we've been learning from it, improving on it, making it our own. The human fleet suddenly began demonstrating capabilities that shouldn't have existed. Ships that had been damaged were somehow repairing themselves using what appeared to be nanotechnology. Vessels that had exhausted their ammunition were manufacturing new weapons from raw materials stored in their cargo bays. Most impossibly, the human ships seemed to be sharing targeting data and tactical information through some kind of quantum communication network.